Uh, 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 uh. And then Applejack says, but that's where the abominable snowman lives. And then the Rainboom says, Parlo says, the abominable snowman? Where Parlo says, what does the abominable means? In the... Just like that when Parlo says, what does the abominable means? Then Applejack says, it means bad, where Parlo says, now I get it, where Applejack says, the marshmallow frost is guarded by the abominable snowman, where Twilight says, does it belong to him? Where Applejack says, no, it belongs to everybody, but he just want to keep it all to himself, where Parlo says, rude, in the... Just like that when Parlo says, rude, where Twilight says, I know, it's really rude. The abominable snowman wants to keep all the frosting all to himself, where Twilight says, but don't worry, I'll go with Applejack and Parlo, and you stay here, we'll get the marshmallow frosting, where Fluttershy says, good luck, and be careful, where Rarity says, oh, I forgot, where Rarity says, watch out for the abominable snowman, where Rarity says, I hope they heard me, where Fluttershy says, you heard Rarity, be careful, in the... Just like that when Fluttershy says, be careful, where Parlo says, ready, Applejack? Ready, Twilight? Ready? Where Parlo says, wait, who are you? Where the abominable snowman says, fine. Where Parlo says, Rainboom, where Twilight says, it's the abominable snowman, let's get out of here. Where Parlo says, let's try that again. Where Parlo says, ready, Applejack? Ready, Twilight? You too, the abominable snowman. Where Parlo says, wait, the abominable snowman? They said, let's get out of here. And then the abominable snowman says, fine. Where Parlo says, let's get out of here. Where Parlo says, he's catching up to us. Step on it, Applejack. And then the abominable snowman says, fine. Where Parlo says, I think we lost him. Where Parlo says, how are we going to get away from that the abominable snowman? Or when Parlo says, let's not forget last time that the toddlers made Starlight Glimmer disappeared, where Twilight says, yeah, all they left was her hat. Also, where Parlo says, okay, we got the invitations, where Twilight says, I'll read them, where Twilight says, we have Rosie, and then Rainbow Dash says, oh no, Rosie is a monster, where Twilight says, and Raspberry, then Parlo says, not my little sister, even her wand is rude. Where Twilight says, and there's Nettle Elf. And then Applejack says, my little sister, she's got a sting nettle on her hat. And it stings when somebody touches it. Where Twilight says, yeah, I know, that happens to me. Where Starlight Glimmer says, hi Rainboom, hi Parlo. Where he says, hi Starlight Glimmer. Where Starlight Glimmer says, you must be Parlo Star. Then Parlo says, yeah, I'm a cat.